One of the most controversial Republican members of Congress is considering a run for Senate. Representative Marjorie Taylor Greene from Georgia said 9/11 was done by the U.S. government, that the Parkland, Florida school mass shooting was a false flag, and that a deadly California wildfire was caused by laser beams from space. Her possible entry into the Georgia Senate race has some Republicans speaking out, warning it could cost them a winnable seat. Joining us to discuss, Alexander Bolden, senior staff writer here at The Hill. Hey, Alex, so you're out with a story today that has some interesting quotes, and I'll start with one from Texas Senator John Cornyn. When he was asked about Greene getting in the race, he said, "I'm sorry, Brian Kemp's not running." Kemp is the current governor of Georgia, said this week he wasn't going to run. Seems like the reaction from many Senate Republicans was, uh-oh.
That's right, because Brian Kemp was their top recruit. Senate Majority Leader John Thune, personally got involved in the recruiting effort to try to persuade Brian Kemp to jump into the Georgia Senate race. This is a recruitment effort that's been going on, since the last Congress. Even when Mitch McConnell was the Senate Republican leader, there were efforts to entice Kemp to run. And, Republicans think back to 2022. They thought that they should have beaten Raphael Warnock, the Democratic senator, but their nominee, Herschel Walker, the former NFL star, like Marjorie Taylor Greene, he had a track record of saying controversial and frankly nonsensical things. And it was something that the Democrats hit on repeatedly during that campaign. It ended up being a very close race, but Warnock won. And so what Republicans are worried about is that there's a, deja vu. They're getting this sense of deja vu that Marjorie Taylor Greene could jump into the race, and while she would probably win the primary, would be at a disadvantage in the general election against an incumbent, John Ossoff, whom Republicans view as quite weak and very vulnerable.
Yeah, you talked about Ossoff, who holds the seat now, considered vulnerable. President Trump obviously won Georgia last year, but Ossoff showed himself to be a pretty formidable candidate when he first ran. He's raising a lot of money. Would he welcome
Mhm.
Greene into the race?
Well, we asked Ossoff that question yesterday as he was walking back to his office from a vote, and we asked him both about Kemp not getting into the race, which I think is a big sigh of relief for him, and then we asked him, would he like to run against Marjorie Taylor Greene, who would be a beatable opponent, I think, in the opinions of both Democratic and Republican strategists, and he kept a steady poker face, didn't even twitch a facial muscle. He just kind of kept his eyes kind of on the floor and said, I'm gonna run hard, whoever it is, and I'm gonna, take on the challenger, and I can beat, whoever runs against me. So, that's the textbook answer when asked that question. But there's no doubt that he would much rather run against Marjorie Taylor Greene than against Brian Kemp, the governor, who's popular and I think is looking at potential presidential run. But look. I asked Thune about this race yesterday, and what he emphasized is that there's a lot of interest. So, maybe it won't be Marjorie Taylor Greene. He cited a few House members. Cited a few statewide candidates, in particular the Agriculture Commissioner Tyler Harper, the Insurance Commissioner John King. So, Thune says that there's a lot of interest in this race, and we'll see what happens.
It seems like President Trump would have a lot of sway here. How close are Greene and Trump? And do you think he would sign off on her running for that Senate seat? As you said, it wouldn't be the first time he endorsed a controversial candidate in that state.
That's the million-dollar question. And Marjorie Taylor Greene is about is probably the most pro MAGA, or is as pro MAGA as anyone on Capitol Hill. I mean, she is a true Trump loyalist, and she is some of the Republican senators who criticized her potential Senate run. Her spokesperson gave me a statement yesterday and said, like, look, these folks who are questioning her viability in the general election, they never really supported Trump. They're doubters, and she would run as a true red MAGA patriot. And now the question is, what does Trump do? I think on one hand, he would be tempted to endorse someone who really has shown unflinching, unquestioned loyalty, who has entertained the conspiracy theories, to be perfectly frank, that are popular in some corners of MAGA world. She is popular with the MAGA base, so I can see why or how Trump may be tempted to endorse her, but he's going to come under a lot of pressure from John Thune, for example, or Tim Scott, the chairman of the Republican Senatorial Committee, not to do that, to either stay neutral and endorse someone else. And we'll just see what happens. If he were to endorse Marjorie Taylor Greene, that would be an end of story. She would win the nomination. But the question is, what will he do? And it's very hard to predict.
For Republicans that don't want her to run for that seat, what kind of tactics could they use to try to block her? Is it all about, lobbying Trump to stay out of it or endorse someone else?
Yeah, I think I would look, back to the last election cycle where you had, Steve Daines, who is close with President Trump. He was the former chairman of the National Republican Senatorial Committee. He worked with Trump in Montana in particular, persuaded Trump to endorse Tim Sheehy, who was kind of the establishment candidate, and the candidate that was preferred by the Senate Republican leadership in the Republican primary. That basically closed the way for another contender in the Montana Senate race, Matt Rosendale, who's a firebrand conservative who ran against John Tester in 2018 but lost. That was they got Trump to endorse the candidate they wanted in Montana. So I think they would try to use that same playbook, in Georgia. And that's something they didn't do back in 2022. They did not use Trump effectively to keep Herschel Walker out of the race. And they got a candidate who was they did not think was a great candidate and ultimately lost. So will they be able to persuade Trump? I mean, on the one hand, they can make the argument that control of the Senate is very critical to confirming Trump's judicial nominees, his executive branch appointments, passing Congressional Review Act proposals to unwind resolutions, although at that point it probably can't be used. But, they will make the case to Trump that control of the Senate is vital, and that's why he has to put maybe aside his personal loyalty to Marjorie Taylor Greene and pick or endorse the more electable candidate, if not stay out of the primary altogether.
Green has also talked about possibly running for Georgia governor. I wonder if some of these Senate Republicans would say, go ahead and run for governor and stay out of our hair. Of course, that might cause some concern among people that run Republican politics in the state of Georgia.
I'm not sure that's a good strategy either because, having a controversial, a lightning rod candidate like Marjorie Taylor Greene who turns off moderates, who turns off swing voters, having her run at the top of the ticket in 2026, even as a gubernatorial candidate, isn't great probably for whomever emerges as the Senate Republican candidate. I mean, that's kind of the, you know, conventional wisdom textbook approach. I mean, we looked at, again, going back to 2022, one of the big reasons why John Fetterman beat Mehmet Oz in that Pennsylvania Senate race is because the Republican nominee for governor was highly controversial and ended up getting crushed by the now Democratic Governor Josh Shapiro. So that probably cost Republicans the Pennsylvania Senate seat back in 2022, having a weak candidate atop the ticket in the governor's race in a midterm. So if Marjorie Taylor Greene is the gubernatorial candidate in Georgia in 2026, that's not great for the Senate race either. So I think Senate Republicans would prefer that Marjorie Taylor Greene stay put in the House. But as her spokesperson said to me in a statement yesterday, she's doing very well in the polling. She has a national fundraising base. She has a huge digital file. She has over 11 million followers on social media. I mean, she's at this point, she's becoming a political giant. So it's hard to see her just staying put in the House. I think she has bigger things in mind, and I think it'll be very tough to stop her, which is why some of the Republican senators I talked to are pretty concerned here.
Yeah, that leads me kind of to my next question. You mentioned some of the other people that were considering getting in the race, not just for the Senate race, but if she ends up running for governor in Georgia, how intimidating of a rival would she be for other Republicans, considering she's a MAGA favorite, she has a huge social media following, can raise a ton of money?
I think she's very intimidating, and I think, I mean, what her spokesperson said to me yesterday is that Republicans are scared about her, scared of her, and the source said that Congresswoman Greene would be any candidate's worst nightmare, and that's how she perceives herself as very formidable, as someone to be reckoned with. She has as I mentioned, one of the largest digital files in all of Congress, has donors from all 50 states, has over 11.6 million followers on social media. She would be very tough, especially, given how polarized politics have become and, how these, primaries are increasingly about, ideological purity. I think, electability, it maybe isn't as important as it used to be in these primaries sometimes. So, she has a huge following. She would generate a ton of media coverage. So I think she would be very tough to beat in a Republican primary. And that's something that, Tom Tillis, for example, who represents another swing state just north of Georgia, North Carolina. He said that she would certainly be a contender in a primary. I think there's no question that she would be very tough to beat in a primary, unless Trump were to personally intervene. And to beat her, it may entail him endorsing someone else and then getting the rest of the party to coalesce that around that alternative. So anyway, it's early in the process. We'll see what happens, but she is looking, as she said on News Nation earlier this week, she's looking very carefully at running for governor or Senate. And if she does either of those two things, it will have an impact on the 2026 Senate race in Georgia.
Be very interesting to see how President Trump responds to a question about what he thinks she should do over there in Georgia. We'll leave it at that. Alexandra Bolden, thanks so much for your time.
Thank you.